The Underground Railroad, America's Secret Network. Chapter 2: The Hell They Ran From. Part 2.1: The Lie of Cotton, King and His Slaves. Picture this. It's a summer evening in Charleston, South Carolina, 1859. The sun dips low behind the grand mansions of the Battery. Gas lamps flicker to life. Inside the ballroom of the Calhoun estate, 100 guests sip French champagne. The women in silk gowns imported from Paris. The men in tailored waistcoats, tobacco cigars in hand. A string quartet plays Mozart while white-gloved servants glide between the chandeliers. Southern nobility, Southern wealth, Southern charm. But what built it? Not the charm, not the culture, not the land. Cotton did, and cotton, as every planter knew, had one essential ingredient: slavery. This is the lie of cotton, the illusion of refinement built on relentless brutality. A crop that clothed the world while bleeding a nation dry. If this was the land of liberty, the abolitionist Theodore Parker once asked, why did its economy run on chains? By 1860, over 4 million people were enslaved in the United States. According to census records, the vast majority of them were in the South, picking cotton, cutting sugarcane, harvesting rice, or laboring in homes and shipyards. Cotton wasn't just a crop, it was the engine of empire. Historian Sven Beckett, in Empire of Cotton, notes that by the mid-19th century, cotton accounted for more than 50% of US exports, the majority of it produced in the South. In fact, cotton represented about 2/3 of all American export revenue by 1860. Put another way, America was getting rich selling what enslaved people bled to grow. The South knew this. They bragged about it. Cotton is king, declared Senator James Hammond of South Carolina in an infamous 1858 speech. No power on earth dares to make war upon it. Cotton is king. And yet, the world that cotton built was a fiction. The wealth of the Southern planter class, its mansions, its carriages, its columns and courtyards, was bought with forced labor and human suffering on an industrial scale. The average enslaved field hand-picked 150 to 200 pounds of cotton per day. That wasn't a goal, it was a quota. Fall short, and you were whipped, or worse. And this wasn't a rare exception, it was the norm. In Gateway to Freedom, historian Eric Foner writes, the cotton boom transformed the South into a one-crop society dependent on the constant expansion of slavery, not just across space, but across bodies. What does that mean? It means cotton wasn't just planted in fields, it was planted in wombs. But we'll get to that. First, let's understand just how thoroughly the South's identity was tangled up in cotton and in slavery. By 1860, 75% of all exports from the US were produced by enslaved labor. More millionaires per capita lived in Mississippi's plantation counties than anywhere else in the nation. 1 out of every 3 Southerners was enslaved. And yet, the political rhetoric of the day, especially from the South, spoke of liberty, states' rights, and independence. What kind of independence requires chains? Even as the North began industrializing, with factories, railroads, and banking systems, the South clung to its agricultural aristocracy. But that aristocracy had one key dependency: cheap, permanent, inheritable labor. Slavery wasn't just tolerated, it was essential, and the numbers prove it. In a ledger from a Louisiana plantation owner dated 1856, he lists 78 enslaved people as fixed capital assets, right below his equipment and livestock. Each person was given an assigned value, ranging from $500 for children to over $1.80 for strong male laborers. One enslaved man, aged 25, is listed as worth $1.600, the equivalent of over $55 today. Adjusted for inflation, this wasn't a fluke, it was how the economy worked. Banks issued loans against enslaved people as collateral. Insurance companies, yes, even northern ones, sold policies on enslaved lives. If a slave died in transport or work, the owner could file a claim. This was capitalism without mercy. and it was enforced with law. After the international slave trade was banned in 1808, the US doubled down on domestic slavery, which meant enslaved families were bred, broken up, and sold within the country to meet rising demand. By 1860, the internal slave trade, the buying and selling of enslaved people across state lines, was worth more than $20 million a year. That's more than $700 million today. Entire cities, New Orleans, Richmond, Charleston, became centers of human trafficking. The South's prosperity wasn't accidental. It was engineered with whips, laws, and silence. And here's the plot twist. Even many in the North knew it and profited anyway. Northern textile mills ran on Southern cotton. Wall Street banks funded Southern plantations. Major newspapers tiptoed around the issue to avoid alienating Southern readers and advertisers. It wasn't just a Southern sin, it was an American industry. So when people today say slavery was a Southern problem, what they really mean is, we prefer to believe the lie. Because the truth is harder. The truth is that the United States, the self-declared land of liberty, ran one of the most brutal, organized, and profitable slave systems in modern history, and did it with legislative approval, financial backing, and global demand. Cotton was king, but it sat on a throne of bones. And if you're wondering what this has to do with the Underground Railroad, the answer is everything. Because the railroad didn't just move people, it shattered illusions. Every successful escape was a crack in the system, a disruption of the balance sheet, a refusal to accept the terms of property. And the people who ran weren't running from labor, they were running from being owned. But even that doesn't fully explain it. To understand the hell they ran from, we have to go deeper. Not into the fields, but into the bedrooms, the birth records, the breeding bonds. Because after 1808, when importing slaves was banned, the South got creative. It turned to what it called natural increase, and it weaponized black motherhood. Next up, Part 2.2, Born in Chains, the business of breeding. Stay with us. If this part of history is new to you, make sure to hit that subscribe button. At MetaFacts Legends, we reveal the powerful stories that textbooks miss. Don't forget to check the description for exclusive insights and more resources about the real cost of freedom. Part 2.2, Born in Chains, the business of breeding. They didn't call them women, they called them breeders. And in the account books of slaveholders from Virginia to Mississippi, you won't find references to mothers, or daughters, or wives. You'll find columns of numbers, ages, weights, fertility notes, a cold arithmetic of human reproduction. This was America, 19th century, and after the international slave trade was outlawed in 1808, the South faced a problem. Its cotton empire needed bodies, but it could no longer legally import enslaved people from Africa or the Caribbean. So it found a solution. It made them, literally. This wasn't a policy printed in newspapers or shouted from podiums. It was something quieter, more insidious. Slaveholders began to rely on what they called natural increase. The idea that enslaved people would reproduce fast enough to grow the labor force from within. But this natural increase was anything but natural. It was manipulated, monitored, and monetized. In Soul by Soul, Life Inside the Antebellum Slave Market, historian Walter Johnson reveals how slaveholders began to prize not just physical strength, but reproductive potential. Young girls, barely into puberty, were assessed for their hips, their pelvic bones, the temperament. A teenage girl who had already given birth was seen as more valuable. A proven breeder. The twisted logic of the slave market turned maternity into merchandise. A woman who could bear 5, 6, or 10 children over her lifetime represented exponential profit. Every baby born into slavery meant one less purchase on the open market, one more asset on the plantation's balance sheet. And so began one of the darkest chapters of American slavery, the industrialization of black motherhood. In private correspondence, plantation owners spoke in a code that stripped the humanity from the women they owned. Jemima is good stock. dropped her third this year. Mary's girl looks promising, wide-hipped like the mother. Keep Hannah with the buck. Should get a strong foal by spring. They weren't just owning people. They were running breeding farms, especially in states like Virginia and Maryland, where the soil was less ideal for cotton. Many plantations shifted their economic model. They bred and sold enslaved people to the Deep South, where labor was in high demand. It was domestic trafficking, and it was legal, and the women had no say. They were raped, routinely, systematically, sometimes by their enslavers, sometimes by other enslaved men, forced into pairings, sometimes by overseers instructed to ensure conception. Pregnancy was not a private experience. It was a watched process, an investment, and once the child was born, the clock began ticking. When could it be sold? When would it be strong enough to carry water? Then tools, then bales of cotton. There was no maternity leave, no nursing privacy. In fact, many mothers were separated from their children within days, weeks if they were lucky. We know this not just from books, but from the voices of those who survived. In the WPA slave narratives, collected in the 1930s by the Federal Writers Project, a woman named Eliza Baker recalled, "I had 9 children, all sold, 4 they could walk good. Master said I was too good a breeder to keep just one. Said he could get more from the young ones than from me." She never held a birthday party, never watched them learn to read, never saw them become adults. She was a womb for profit. Eliza's story isn't rare, it's representative. And yet, this machinery of reproduction operated behind whitewashed walls and genteel front porches. The same homes where Southern bills served tea, where Bibles were read at supper, where visitors admired the Southern way of life. The contradiction was unbearable, so they buried it. Slaveholders rarely spoke publicly about the breeding system. It wasn't polite, but it was common knowledge. Enslaved women, especially between the ages of 15 and 30, were bought at premium prices. Some slave markets even listed proven fertility as part of the description. Eric Foner, in Gateway to Freedom, notes, by the 1850s, the majority of enslaved people in the United States had been born into slavery. Their mothers, grandmothers, and great-grandmothers had lived and died as legal property. This was no longer just a labor system. It was a generational prison. And the cruelty wasn't just physical. Imagine being a 13-year-old girl, raped by the man who owned you, and told that your child would belong to him too. Imagine delivering a baby, holding it for a few months, then watching it sold downriver before you even knew its smile. Imagine doing that 9 times. That was Eliza Baker, and she wasn't alone. There's a reason Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, and countless other women who escaped slavery became fierce defenders of black womanhood. Because they knew what slavery really meant. Not just forced labor, but forced motherhood. And in a world where your ability to give life was twisted into a source of pain, the only real rebellion was to run, or, sometimes, to refuse to reproduce. There are testimonies, often whispered, sometimes denied, of women drinking herbal mixtures to induce miscarriages, of midwives who taught each other how to avoid pregnancy, of silent networks of resistance among enslaved women who refused to be factories for a system that would never love their children. One story tells of a woman in Mississippi who fell down the stairs 4 times in 1 year. Her owner eventually sold her for being unproductive. She smiled the day she was taken away. There is a quiet defiance in survival, and a louder one in escape. But whether they ran or stayed, the women of slavery lived under a reality most of us cannot fathom. Their bodies were never truly their own, and their children were born into chains. As we move forward in this story, we arrive at the marketplace. Because once these children were born, once they grew past infancy, they were not seen as sons or daughters. They were seen as inventory. Next up, Part 2.3 Auction Blocks and Broken Bloodlines. Stay with us. Part 2.3 Auction Blocks and Broken Bloodlines. They stood naked on the block, sometimes fully exposed, sometimes in rags that barely covered the bruises. Women, men, children, turned side to side, mouths inspected, teeth checked like horses, backs examined for lash scars, thighs for muscle tone, stomachs for signs of pregnancy. This wasn't a nightmare, it was policy. It was called the scramble, a term used in slave markets from New Orleans to Charleston. Prospective buyers would literally rush forward, scrambling, to grab the enslaved people they wanted, often dragging them aside to examine their bodies in private before haggling the price like cattle at a fair. In the South, this wasn't shocking. It was Saturday. Slave markets operated 6 days a week. Sunday was for church. By the 1850s, New Orleans had become the largest slave trading hub in the United States. Thousands passed through each year. Charleston, Richmond, Mobile, and Natchez weren't far behind. The industry was so lucrative that it generated millions of dollars annually, fueling not just plantation profits, but hotels, banks, transport companies, and law offices. According to Soul by Walter Johnson, some traders became celebrities in their own right. Isaac Franklin and John Omfield, for example, built an empire moving enslaved people from Virginia to Louisiana. They sold more than 1.00 people a year, and eventually retired as some of the wealthiest men in America. But wealth is built on someone else's loss. And in this case, it was children. Here's one story, pulled directly from the WPA Slave Narratives, a collection of first-hand interviews with formerly enslaved people. Recorded in the 1930s, a man named Henry Box Wilson remembered. "I was 8 when they sold me. Mama held me tight. I wrapped my arms round her neck and wouldn't let go. They whipped her. She screamed. I screamed too. They tore us apart. I ain't never seen her again. No funeral, no goodbye, no closure. Just another transaction. And it wasn't rare." Historian Stephen Dale, in Carry Me Back, estimates that nearly half of enslaved people sold in the domestic slave trade were separated from immediate family, parents from children, husbands from wives, siblings from siblings. Sometimes, a mother would be forced to bathe and dress her own child before watching him be sold away. And sometimes, just to add a bitter layer of cruelty, enslaved children were told they were going on a trip or to visit cousins. Only later, after days in a wagon or a boat, did they realize they weren't coming back. These were not isolated cruelties, they were features of the system. The twisted logic of the slave economy treated family ties as financial liabilities. A strong, obedient man without emotional attachments was considered a better investment than one who might rebel over a wife or a child. Love was a risk, attachment, a threat. And here's the twist, the one that history books often gloss over. Some slaveholders used the Bible to justify this. In sermons and plantation instruction manuals, they quoted scriptures like Ephesians chapter 6 verse 5, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear." They pointed to the Old Testament patriarchs who held slaves. They argued that separating families was a necessary discipline, comparing it to Abraham being asked to sacrifice his son. One pamphlet, titled The Religious Instruction of the Negroes in the United States, published in 1842, advised plantation owners to use divine authority to remind enslaved people that earthly suffering is part of God's design. Imagine watching your child sold away and being told that it was God's will. That salvation required silence, that resistance was sin. Yet, despite all this, enslaved families still loved fiercely. They created marriages without legal recognition. They invented naming traditions to preserve lineages. They taught their children songs and stories to remember who they were, even if the law said otherwise. In one slave narrative, a man recalled, "My mama used to whisper my real name at night. Said don't let them take it, even if they change it. Don't forget what she gave me." Names, memories, they were all they had, because the market took everything else. We often think of slavery in terms of labor, fields, whips, chains, but forget this. It was also a system of destruction, designed not just to control bodies, but to erase bloodlines. The auction block was the guillotine of the family tree. So when someone escaped slavery, it wasn't just a break for freedom. It was a race against obliteration. A chance to find a mother, a daughter, a brother long lost, a voice remembered only in dreams. And if the story ended here, it would already be unbearable. But there was more, because what broke people, even more than the pain or the loss, was what came next: the silence, the invisibility, the transformation from human being to ledger entry. They gave you a price, a birth date, maybe, but not a name. Which brings us to the next chapter. The violence wasn't the worst part. The worst part was becoming nothing. Next up, part 2.4. The violence wasn't the worst part. Stay with us. Part 2.4. The violence wasn't the worst part. They whipped people until the blood soaked the ground. They branded children like cattle, hot irons pressed to skin no older than 10. They chained men to posts for days, starved them, gagged them, lashed them for talking back, or for not smiling when spoken to. And yet, the worst part wasn't the pain. It was the erasure. The real horror of slavery wasn't just in the wounds. It was in what came after the wounds healed. The silence, the loss of self, the deliberate destruction of identity. They gave you a number. One former enslaved woman told the WPA slave narratives, not a name. In many plantations, that wasn't metaphor, it was policy. Field workers were sometimes referred to by their job or position. Number 4, plow. Number 2, hand. Kitchen girl. Overseers used sticks or whistles to direct them. Like livestock, names, those tiny miracles of personhood, were not recognized. New arrivals were renamed immediately. A boy called Kofi became Tom. A girl named Alma became Sally. Whole lineages erased in one sentence. You weren't your mother's child. You were someone's property, legally, in court documents, plantation inventories, wills, and insurance records. Enslaved people were listed alongside oxen and wheelbarrows. A typical document might read, 2 strong Negro men, ages 22 and 25, valued at $1.600. 1 breeding wench, age 19 minus $1.200. 1 boy, age 6 minus $400. 1 plow horse minus $250. No surnames, no histories, just market value. And when that value diminished, punishment began. According to Eric Foner in Gateway to Freedom, plantation punishments weren't just tools of control. They were performances, acts of psychological warfare designed to remind everyone, constantly, who held the whip and who wore the chains. Foner writes, public punishment was as much about spectacle as discipline. It sent a message. This is not your body. This is not your life. Punishment varied from place to place, but the most common methods were flogging, 100 lashes or more, sometimes until the back opened like a wound. The stocks, wooden clamps around arms and legs, exposed to sun, bugs, and humiliation. The gag, a metal bar forced into the mouth and locked behind the head, designed to silence. The collar, a thick iron ring with upward spikes, preventing sleep or rest. And perhaps the most terrifying of all, the threat of sale. The looming possibility that you could be sold south, away from family, away from whatever sliver of stability you had, was enough to break most spirits. Slaveholders called it sending him downriver, to New Orleans, to the cane fields, to death. So people obeyed on the outside, but on the inside, they died a little more each day. And here's the twist. For many, the goal wasn't escape at first. It was survival. People adapted, pretended, hid pieces of themselves in plain sight, smiled when ordered, sang when told, nodded in sermons designed to keep them submissive. But inside, they held on to fragments. A whispered name, a melody from a grandmother, a carved figure passed hand to hand. Resistance, in its quietest form, began with remembering, because the system wasn't just built to exploit labor, it was built to annihilate identity. And yet, Even in the most brutal environments, people found ways to reclaim themselves. Some carved symbols into tree trunks or the backs of hidden doors. Some scratched their African names into the underside of furniture. Some learned to read in secret, using torn pages from the Bible or old newspapers. There was power in knowing your name. There was danger in it too. Being caught writing or reading could mean whipping, mutilation, or death. In one case from Georgia, a young boy was caught with a pencil and notebook. His owner cut off 2 fingers and ordered them nailed above the schoolhouse door. The boy survived. Years later, he joined the Union Army and learned to write again with his left hand. We know his name, Samuel Rivers. The system tried to erase him. It failed. But for every Samuel, there were hundreds whose names never returned. And for those still enslaved, even worship, even rest, wasn't truly theirs. Because even Sunday wasn't safe. Next up, part 2.5, when Sunday wasn't safe. Stay with us. Feeling the weight of this story? Drop a comment below and let us know how this moment of history impacts you. Also, take a look at the description for a deeper dive into the shocking truths about slavery and what it took to escape. Part 2.5, when Sunday wasn't safe. The bell rang at dawn. Not the work bell, the Sunday bell. For one day each week, the fields stood still. No cotton picked, no wood chopped, no overseers barking orders. It was the Sabbath, God's day. But for enslaved people, Sunday wasn't freedom. It was theater, a carefully staged performance where even worship was owned. Across the South, enslaved people were gathered and marched, sometimes chained, sometimes under watch, to plantation churches or makeshift chapels. The preacher was often a white man, sometimes a black man approved by the master. The message was always the same: obedience. The most preached passage in slave sermons came from Ephesians chapter 6 verse 5. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling. There was no talk of Exodus, no Moses parting the Red Sea, no Jesus turning over tables in the temple. Just submission, endurance, afterlife. Heaven would come, Sunday. But for now, the chains were God's will. Plantation owners loved these services. They believed religion made the enslaved more docile. In fact, many required attendance. In some counties, plantation churches were registered with local governments and overseen by religious supervisors whose job was to monitor the messages. The sermons were reviewed, rehearsed, and in some cases, ghostwritten by slaveholders themselves. In a Georgia plantation manual from 1855, the master outlined sermon guidelines. No mention of liberation stories from the Old Testament. All readings must be approved in advance. Emphasize the spiritual rewards of faithful servitude. This wasn't faith, it was control dressed in scripture. But here's the twist: the enslaved understood the game. They sat through the sermons. They bowed their heads, but they also listened between the lines, and afterward, when the white eyes were gone, they gathered for something very different. Hush harbors, secret services held in woods, behind cabins, or in swamp clearings, often at night, sometimes in absolute silence except for a hum, a beat, a moan. This was where the real gospel was preached. Songs about crossing rivers, about stars leading the way, about chariots swinging low and angels guiding footsteps. These weren't just spirituals, they were coded maps. The Jordan River was the Ohio River. Canaan meant Canada. Going home meant escape. And the preacher, sometimes it was the same man who stood in front of them on Sunday morning. That's where this story turns. Because not every enslaved minister was a puppet. Some were spies. One such man was Reverend Isaiah, a black preacher from North Carolina. He had been raised in the house, taught to read, and given permission to lead weekly services under the master's supervision, of course. At first, he towed the line, quoted the verses, urged peace. He became a trusted voice. Until he didn't. According to accounts preserved in the William Still papers, Isaiah began secretly helping fugitives. He used his sermons to signal plans, preaching longer when the coast was clear, shorter when patrols were out. He included phrases like "harvest is near" to warn that escape was coming. His pulpit became a platform for rebellion, and eventually he disappeared. Some say he made it to Philadelphia and worked directly with the Vigilance Committee. Others say he was caught and hanged in secret. His name isn't on most historical lists, but the stories remain, passed down like psalms. Because faith, for the enslaved, wasn't just comfort, it was code. It was the only thing that couldn't be whipped or bought. And even the masters sensed it. In a letter from a plantation owner in Louisiana to his cousin in 1857, he writes, "I believe the Negro preacher speaks with a double tongue. They shout Amen with their mouths, but something else brews beneath." He was right. In the hush harbors, the people didn't shout Amen. They whispered it, like a promise, that someday the sermon would be true, that the meek really would inherit the earth, that the captives really would go free. And until then, they would resist, not always with fire, but with silence, with song, with shadow, because even in chains, they still had their minds, and their memories, and their methods. Next up, Part 2.6, Resistance in the Shadows. Stay with us. Part 2.6, Resistance in the Shadows. They didn't always run. Sometimes they stayed and fought in ways so quiet, so subtle, the overseer didn't even notice until the cotton came up short, or the plow broke again, or the mule mysteriously went lame. We often imagine resistance to slavery as escape, as dramatic flight through forests under starlight. And yes, those stories are real, but they were only one kind of rebellion. The truth is, most enslaved people couldn't run. They had children, they were watched too closely. They had no maps, no allies, no chance, so they resisted the only way they could, in the shadows, by turning the daily machinery of slavery against itself. They broke tools, accidentally. They slowed the pace of work. They pretended not to understand commands. They sang songs with double meanings. They forgot how to cook certain recipes. They lost keys. They got sick. This wasn't laziness. It was strategy, as historian Stephanie Camp writes in Closer to Freedom. These acts, small, repeated, cumulative, were how enslaved people seized moments of autonomy inside the architecture of domination. Let's start with food. Slaves were rationed barely enough to survive. Cornmeal, pork fat, maybe beans or molasses, but they often grew secret gardens, hid onions, okra, peppers behind cabins or deep in the woods. Sometimes they stole food from the master's kitchen, carefully, sparingly, to avoid detection. Other times, they burned it. In one account from Louisiana, a woman was caught salting a barrel of meat until it spoiled. When questioned, she said, "I thought it was sugar, sir." She was whipped, but she smiled when it was over, because the spoiled barrel meant a hungry master. Let's talk about medicine. Slavery pushed many women into the role of healers. They knew herbs, roots, and teas. Some passed this knowledge from West African traditions. They treated infections, eased labor pains, even soothed nightmares, and sometimes they used it to say no. In Killing the Black Body by Dorothy Roberts, we find accounts of enslaved women using abortive herbs like cottonroot bark, pennyroyal, and tansy to induce miscarriages. Why? Because they refused to give birth to more property. They would not bear children for a system that stole their names, their milk, and their futures. One enslaved woman, known only as Dinah, reportedly told her midwife, "I'd rather my baby be with the Lord than in his litter." Some plantations banned women from handling certain plants. Too late. Resistance had already taken root. Now let's talk sabotage. In 1838, a boat carrying cotton down the Mississippi began to sink just outside Natchez. The crew blamed termites, rats, anything, but the truth was simpler. Someone had carved tiny holes into the hull the night before departure. An enslaved man who worked on the dock later said, "The rats learned how to use knives that week." "Oh no, boss, rats again." They couldn't storm the master's house, but they could sink his profits. Another case, a blacksmith named Ben in South Carolina subtly warped the plantation's plow blades, making them wear down faster. Each replacement cost the owner money. No one ever suspected Ben. After all, he was the best smith around. He never stopped smiling. Resistance wasn't rage. It was patience sharpened to a point. Now consider music. Enslaved people sang while they worked, not because they were happy, but because it masked conversations. A slow rhythm meant slow down. A sudden tempo shift could mean the overseer is coming. Entire plans were whispered through melody. Even joy, yes, joy, was a form of resistance. Laughing in the face of dehumanization was an act of defiance. Dancing, storytelling, marriage, these weren't just cultural rituals. They were declarations. We are still human. And for every whispered joke, for every night of secret drums and laughter under the moon, there was a line being drawn in the soul. You can own my labor, but not my life, not my mind, not my joy, not my child, if I choose otherwise. Even the children resisted. One story tells of a boy in Virginia who, after being ordered to polish a boot, spit inside it and wiped it with a rag. When the master screamed at him for the smell, the boy shrugged and said, "Maybe your foot's just bad, sir." He was beaten. But years later, he told his granddaughter, "That was the first time I felt like a man." Let's be clear, this wasn't safe. Every act of sabotage, or spiritual defiance, came with the risk of torture or death. But still, they did it. Day after day, life after life, 1,000 tiny revolts waged in kitchens, fields, prayer circles, and cotton barges. They couldn't overthrow the system, but they could grind it down. Slavery tried to turn them into tools. They became termites. They burrowed in the dark. They weakened the beams. And when the structure finally collapsed, the world gave credit to generals and presidents. But it was built, cracked, and ultimately dismantled by the ones who lived within it. Next up, Part 2.7, The Price of a Body. Stay with us. Part 2.7, The Price of a Body. The ledger didn't blink. Negro male, age 24, strong, no known illness, $1.20. Just below him, one mule, age 5, healthy, $75. Same ink, same handwriting, same logic. This was not an accounting error. It was the world as it was. A world where people were priced like livestock, insured like cargo, and mortgaged like land. And in that world, the body had value, but the soul, optional. Let's start with the math. According to advertisements in the Charleston Mercury and sales records preserved in the New Orleans Notarial Archives, the average price for an adult male slave in 1850 hovered around $1.20, equivalent to roughly $40 today. Adjusted for inflation, prices varied. Of course, a skilled blacksmith might fetch $1.800. A woman of childbearing age, strong and obedient, might be listed at $1, with higher value if she'd already borne children. A child under 10 might be sold for as little as $300. But the point wasn't just the numbers. It was what they represented, the monetization of humanity. Slavery wasn't some archaic leftover of a pre-modern world. It was an economic engine, running on spreadsheets and contracts, funded by banks and backed by law. And here's where the twist hits hardest. It wasn't just the South. Northern banks, from New York, Boston, Philadelphia, financed the Southern slave economy. They issued loans to plantation owners using enslaved people as collateral. If the debt defaulted, the bank had the legal right to seize those human beings and sell them at auction. According to research from the New York Historical Society, firms like Citibank and J.P. Morgan Chase trace parts of their early capital to loans and policies tied to slave labor. In a 2005 statement, J.P. Morgan itself acknowledged, two of our predecessor banks, Citizens Bank and Canal Bank in Louisiana, accepted approximately 13,000 enslaved individuals as collateral between the 1830s and 1860s. Let that number sink in. 13,000 souls. Used to secure lines of credit. And it didn't stop there. Insurance companies like New York Life sold policies on enslaved people's lives. If a slave died on the journey south or during labor, the owner could collect a payout. Yes, enslaved people were insured, not to protect them, but to guarantee profits. Harvard historian Sven Beckett, in Empire of Cotton, explains it plainly. Slavery was not a pre-modern anachronism. It was central to global capitalism. Let's go deeper. Enslaved people weren't just assets. They were appreciating assets, because unlike a mule or a plow, an enslaved person could reproduce. A woman who bore 5 children increased the master's wealth fivefold, without ever leaving the plantation. This is why, by 1860, the total value of enslaved people in the US exceeded $3 billion, more than the combined value of all the factories, railroads, and banks in the country at the time. Let's put it plainly, enslaved people were the single largest financial asset in the United States. More valuable than land, more valuable than cotton, more valuable than gold. And yet, their value wasn't in who they were. It was in what could be taken from them. The economist in the counting house saw muscles, not memories, fertility, not family, teeth, not tenderness. To the market, a man's name didn't matter, only his productivity. That's why, in sales documents, you'll find lines like, "Sound Negro fellow, known to carry 250 pounds. Girl, age 15, fine health, obedient. Boy, Samuel, missing 2 fingers, discounted." Discounted, as if pain made you less human, as if trauma had a return policy. And here's the sickest part. These price tags followed them for life. When a slave was sold, the book value was reassessed. When a woman was pregnant, she was often reappraised upward. When an elderly slave could no longer work, their value dropped, and they were often sold to harsher owners or abandoned altogether. Even death had an economic footprint. Some plantation owners sold the teeth of dead slaves to dentists. Others dissected bodies for local medical colleges, who needed anatomical specimens, not to study justice, but to teach surgery. To this system, black bodies weren't people, they were products. And in product economies, the only thing that matters is price. So let's compare. In the 1850s, a well-built house in Georgia, $800. A top-quality horse, $200. A prime male field hand, $1.20. A reading wench, 22 years old, $1. A defiant boy, age 10, $350. You didn't own your breath, you were your value, and that value could be mortgaged, seized, resold. When Harriet Jacobs, author of Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, overheard her owner discussing her price, she wrote, "I felt myself reduced, not to a servant, but to a thing. A dollar amount in a man's hand." And so people rebelled, not just out of pain, but out of math. They refused to be inventory. Which brings us to the final turn of chapter 2. Because escape wasn't just about running from pain. It was about running toward something lost, toward personhood, toward the unquantifiable, toward a name. Next up, part 2.8, a world without a name, and why they ran. Stay with us. Part 2.8, a world without a name, and why they ran. They didn't always run because of the whip, not because of the blood, not because of the chains, not even because of the hunger. They ran because they couldn't hear their own name anymore. That's the twist history rarely tells. The true terror of slavery wasn't just the violence, it was the erasure. The slow, methodical stripping away of personhood, until a man became a line in a ledger, a girl became a womb with a price tag, and the only sound left was someone else calling you boy, gal, or just number 3. Imagine waking up and no one knows your birthday. No one remembers your real last name. You're told who to love, who to obey, when to eat, where to sleep, and what to be worth. Imagine trying to pray, and the preacher says your suffering is God's will. Imagine smiling for your child, while knowing they'll be sold before they turn 10. That's not life, that's vanishing in plain sight. And that's why they ran. Eric Foner puts it best in Gateway to Freedom. They escaped not from punishment, but from invisibility. We often think of runaways as desperate, impulsive, reckless, but the truth is, running was a declaration, a final act of self-creation in a system designed to unmake you. Running said, I exist, I matter, I am not livestock, I am not $1.20, male, 5'9", I have a name, even if I'm the only one left who says it. And let's be clear, it was nearly suicidal. The odds of success were grim. As we've seen earlier, scholars estimate that only 1 in 5 enslaved escape attempts succeeded. For every person who reached freedom, 4 were caught, beaten, maimed, or sold farther south as punishment. The South passed stricter and stricter laws. Slave patrols grew more aggressive. Rewards for fugitives ballooned. Entire communities, black and white, could be punished for aiding a runaway. So why do it? Why risk death? Because some things are worse than dying. Living as a ghost is one of them. That's what the system did. It made ghosts out of the living. It forced people to watch their families disappear, to forget the faces of their children, to work 16-hour days for a man who called them boy until they forgot the sound of their own voice. The Underground Railroad didn't just help people escape slavery. It helped them escape nothingness. People ran not just for freedom, but for recognition, to be seen, to be named, to be remembered. And here's the twist of all twists. Many who ran didn't run for themselves. They ran for others, for children not yet born, for sisters still trapped, for a chance to return with a map in their head and a whisper in their voice. That's why so many returned south after tasting freedom. They weren't satisfied with escape. They needed to pull others out of the silence too. And in doing so, they didn't just survive history, they wrote it. And that brings us to the next chapter. Because among the thousands who vanished into forests and followed stars north, one woman refused to disappear. She was born Araminta, known to friends as Minty, but history remembers her by the name she chose, Harriet. Coming up next, Chapter 3, The Legend of Harriet Tubman. You're listening to MetaFacts Legends. If this history moved you, if it made you rethink what courage really means, don't forget to follow, subscribe, and share this story, because the ghosts of the past are only forgotten when we stop speaking their names. And we're just getting started. If you believe these stories of courage, sacrifice, and defiance need to be heard, subscribe, share this video, and tell us what part of this story hit home the hardest. Be sure to explore the description for additional readings and links that expand on the fight for freedom.